Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Welcome to the workshop on knowledge-guided machine learning, a framework for accelerating scientific discovery. I am Vipin Kumar, professor of computer science at the University of Minnesota. I will be chairing this opening session along with my colleague, Dr. Michael Steingart, who's also from the University of Minnesota. This workshop is being supported by a grant from NSF's Harnessing the Data Revolution program. The original intent was to have this workshop as in person in Minneapolis, but given the pandemic, we are holding it as a virtual event. And as a side benefit of that has been that it has allowed the workshop to have a much larger audience. We have close to 1,000 registered participants already, spanning about 30 countries. This large participation is also a reflection of the importance and the timeliness of the topic. The organizing committee of this workshop, with whom I will introduce shortly, has assembled a great program with wonderful speakers on this topic. This workshop consists of 6 sessions. Each is about 6 hours long, except for the very last session, which is concluding session on Thursday. All talks will be recorded and made available via our workshop webpage, along with talk slides, subject to permission by presenters. And the great news is that nearly all the presenters have provided us the consent. Most of you would be listening to this presentation via Zoom, but any overflow over about 1,000 participants will move over to the YouTube. Any questions to the presenters will need to be made by using Slido. And those of you who are new to Slido, be assured that it's a very easy app to use. Just follow the instruction on the workshop website, which is also, by the way, the best place to go to for any questions about workshop, including sessions and timings and such. With that, I am going to give you a brief introduction to our project. And let's see. And I'm not able to move my slide to the next one. Okay, let me share my screen again. Okay, yes, finally, I guess the issue is resolved. So this workshop, as I mentioned, is funded by the NSF HDR project with the same title as the workshop. It's a collaborative project between University of Minnesota, Colorado State University, University of Wisconsin, Penn State, and University of Virginia. And its goal is to develop a framework, a knowledge-guided machine learning framework that uses the unique capability of data science models to automatically learn patterns and models from data, but without ignoring the treasures of accumulated scientific knowledge. And on the right side of this slide, you're seeing the KGML team, the 10 investigators that are leading this project collectively, and they're also leading the sessions that you will be participating over in the next 3 days, and you will get to see them one-on-one. So let me start with the introduction to the KGML paradigm and why we're holding this workshop and where we're planning to go from there. So we're in the middle of a big data revolution, and it's enabled by the confluence of 3 factors: the advances in machine learning, advances in computing, and that are fed by the big data that has been growing at ever greater speed. And the confluence of these 3 have revolutionized all aspects of our life. Now, this revolution has been sort of going on slowly for the last 4 decades, but it accelerated in the last 2 decades. And it has really picked up huge steam in the last 5 to 10 years because of, again, the rapid advances in all of these 3 areas. And as a result, it has completely changed the way we live, we interact with each other, we entertain ourselves, we even elect leaders. And certainly it has completely transformed the commercial landscape from many perspectives. And I don't have to belabor the successes. You see them in your life daily. And the fact that we're able to hold this event for 1,000 people is sort of a testimony to that, this revolution. Now, given that these techniques have been so successful in the commercial arena, there is an increasing interest in being able to use the power of this data revolution for accelerating scientific discovery. And again, this is sort of what's coming in from this push is coming from the broader scientific community. And you see that in these cover pages from the iconic journals like Nature and Science. And as a result, NSF, National Science Foundation, most recently created a list of 10 big ideas, NSF's 10 big ideas, and harnessing the data revolution for scientific discovery is one of those major 10 ideas. So that's sort of the topic of this workshop. However, the straightforward applications of machine learning that have done dramatic, that have sort of given dramatic performance in the commercial non-scientific arena have often shown very disappointing results when they're applied to the scientific domain. And there are a number of reasons for that. And of course, this disappointment has led many people in the scientific community to distrust these methods. And there are many reasons for this disappointment. And one of them is that many of these scientific problems are such that they require a huge amount of data. And even though the data is increasing in richness, in size, and variety in scientific domain as well, but the kind of data that we need for some of these very complex, latest state-of-the-art machine learning algorithms to work is actually much larger. And in absence of that, these models can give you results that are not very good, or they may look deceptively good on the small training data set, but generalize to out of sample scenarios. They can also create physically inconsistent results, in the sense that if you're trying to predict the behavior of a large scientific enterprise, there are multiple components of it, and then they all have to sort of, there are some special relationships that they have to observe, like the conservation of mass, energy, and so forth. And machine learning algorithms not being aware of these can sort of, course, certainly create inconsistencies, which is another reason to believe that they would not generalize to out of sample scenarios. And this problem of generalizing an unseen scenario is actually a real one, because no matter how good a machine learning algorithm is, it's still finding statistical patterns, however complex, in the data that's provided to it. That means it cannot look for completely unseen scenarios. For example, if you're looking at the weather, the climate system behavior in the current climate, the machine learning may not be able to predict what would happen in a completely different climate because of non-stationarities and such. And the very last reason is that even if my black box method really is able to provide valuable, actionable insight, it does not necessarily advance the science, in the sense that science sort of builds on understanding of facts, and then you sort of build models, and you build more and more complex models, and you understand the system at a progressively greater detail. And a poster child of, and there are many such cases, but I'm just picking this up, is about several years ago, Google had this Google flu trend. They sort of basically started predicting the outbreak of flu based upon the queries people do on the internet. And they were able to show that they were able to predict the flu outbreak. They were able to predict the flu outbreak a couple of weeks before the CDC could do it. And of course, that was very interesting, very exciting, and except that they, as the system was put in place and they started predicting, and a few years later, the predictions sort of became completely out of whack, in the sense that they were completely out of the reality. And again, the same issue that you're seeing here sort of came up here. So what we're looking at now is this sort of the two different worlds, the community of data scientists, machine learning people who work in computer science, coming from statistics and computer science and related disciplines, who are building these data science models, statistical models, machine learning models. And they are beginning to show tremendous performance when you're talking about massive amount of data, to the point that you can almost say that you don't need theory. And again, this is, of course, an oversimplification, but there are cases like, for example, translating a language from translating text from one language to the other. One could sort of say that the best performance today is obtained by pure data science models that simply are making use of this trillions and trillions of sentences that are available on the web, rather than the ones that are making use of the linguistic theories. So you have situations where if you give massive amount of data, you could almost ignore the scientific theory. But of course, in most applications, you don't have that situation. You have much less data. Then on the other hand, you have a situation in which you have a complete understanding of your mechanistic understanding of your physical system, and then you can make all kinds of prediction, but that happens very rarely. I mean, of course, a poster child of that would be like using the Newtonian physics, you can predict the motions of the planet to the extent that you can launch a probe to Mars, and everything is in motion, and yet the probe would land on Mars many months later, exactly at a point that you expect it to. But most situations that we deal with are much more complex. For example, if you're trying to predict the location of a hurricane or a tornado or the extent of floods, or something even a lot more complex as the sensitivity of the climate to greenhouse gas emissions, the science that is needed to fully predict them is far from complete. And that's where this notion of being able to use the data to help sort of comes in. But then both of these paradigms, if you do them one at a time, they have both limitations. And I must say that they are not exclusive, in the sense that the scientific paradigm, of course, always uses data, and data science model, no matter how simple and black box they are, they have some notion of theory. But the goal here is to see whether we can accelerate the scientific paradigm by using some of the latest state-of-the-art machine learning advances that have really revolutionized our life. So to that extent, sort of there is this movement in the community, a broader community, to look for models that are guided by theory, guided by scientific theory, and then make use of the latest data science advances. So we have sort of named this paradigm as the theory-guided data science models. And it sort of builds on the foundation of the data science, but taking full advantage of the domain theory. And again, this idea of bringing these two things together, of course, has been pursued in many disciplines by many scientists independendly, and people have worked on this idea. And again, just to give an example, even in our own group, we have sort of gone back to as early as 2014 to talk about it. But more recently, in a paper in 2017, it sort of tried to formalize this paradigm, tried to talk about how many different ways the data science models can come together to help the scientific discovery. And this paper, even though it was written more than 3.5 years ago, had a coverage of about 50 plus papers from completely different disciplines who, without knowing or knowingly, were pursuing this paradigm in their respective disciplines. Now, given and because of course, so many people have been talking about it, so people have referred to this from many, many names. Somebody has called it knowledge guided, science guided, physics guided, physics informed, physics aware. In these works, physics or physics guided oftentimes isn't generally interpreted as science or knowledge or scientific knowledge. So there are all of these terms, you will sort of find them being represented in many of the literature. Now, because of course the utility of this combining theory and data science, you have this knowledge guided machine learning paradigm applicable in every single scientific discipline that you can think of. And the work in this direction has been accelerating, with greater and greater speed. And you can sort of see that in this survey that we put together just a few months ago, integrating physics-based modeling with machine learning, again, physics being sort of more generally interpreted here. And the survey covered about 300 papers, most of which were published in the last 3 years. So this sort of tells you the amount of excitement people have in this area. And this is also reflected in the announcement from the funding agencies like the Department of Energy, DARPA, and such, There was a 20-year roadmap for AI that was produced by the NSF and Computing Community Consortium, and it highlighted this topic, in certain ways. And there are many meetings just that are purely focused on this topic of bringing physics or the science and data together. Just in 2020, in addition to the meeting that you are attending, which happens to be the largest one, there are like 5 other meetings in the rest of the year that you can sort of see here being planned or have happened. So this again shows the excitement that's generally available in this area. So the goal of this workshop is to sort of bring this excitement to the community, to assess the progress we have made so far, and by bringing the community, a wider community, which is of course very large, so we have only a small subset of it, and to also discuss some of the progresses people have made and the challenges that face us in making the field forward. So what I'm going to do is, in my opening talk here, is list some of the questions. And this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the questions that are being addressed by many of the talks in this workshop. So one of them, for example, one could ask is, well, physics models are used for all sorts of things in every scientific discipline, or the mechanistic models are used for all sorts of problems. To what extent we can even consider replacing them with machine learning models, even in limited scenarios, in the sense that even if you're not worried about generalizability and physical consistency, but just being able to predict with better accuracy or equal accuracy what the physics models can do. And this is a non-trivial question because the models come in such greater variety. Some of them are much more complex than the others. So the answer of this question doesn't have to be yes all the time. But more importantly, what we sort of aim to see here is what additional advances have to be made in machine learning framework to really make them more suitable for modeling the physics, even if we were just looking at the predictive accuracy. So this is a broad question. And again, you will see that being addressed in many, many talks here. Then the other question would be, now if I'm trying to put knowledge into machine learning models, this is the data science, physics-guided data science, or knowledge-guided machine learning model. Can they be made to produce results that are physically consistent? Can they follow the laws of the physical laws like conservation of mass, energy, and then so forth? Can they work with limited observation data? That is, what if you have very small amount of data? Can they leverage the physics, or can they leverage the knowledge or the science to reduce the reliance on large data? And then can they generalize to scenarios that are not given to them? That is, you looking at going beyond the scientific, going beyond the statistical relationships that are present in the data itself. Can they provide novel insights without which, of course, you cannot advance the field? And again, the last question on this list may seem very incongruous, which might sort of seem, but how could you even talk about it? And this is about, can HTML models be used in an absence of observation data? What if I don't have anything observation? Can I still make use of them? And again, you will see talks in this workshop that are going to be covering many of these topics. I'm going to sort of give you sort of very simple taste of some of these questions answered in the context of a very simple system, a very important system, but relatively simple physical system, which is modeling the dynamics of temperature in lakes. We have lots of lakes in Midwest, and they are important for recreation and fishing and human consumption of water. And the dynamics of water temperature, temperature changes the quality, it has impact on the quality of the water and the quality of fish that can survive in it. And GLM is a state-of-the-art physics-based model that's used by USGS to model these lake systems. And the question is, and I'm going to sort of show you an answer to some of these questions, is to what extent the KGML paradigm could be used to help in this context. And I'm just going to go through it a little bit quickly, given the short amount of time I have. If you have a lake system like this, you have weather drivers, meteorological drivers like temperature, pressure, precipitation, and such. that are readily available from climate system, which is the part of the big data. And then for some of these lakes, for example, lakes such as Lake Mendota, they have a lot of observations that are available to the USGS. And the idea would be that I have the drivers from the weather system, and I have the observations that are available. Could I build some sort of a machine learning framework? Could be a neural network, could be a recurrent neural network, to make predictions based upon these drivers and see the difference between those predictions and the observations to create a training loss and build this model. And this is the traditional paradigm of data science modeling, black box machine learning modeling, that you give me the data, give me the labels, and I will build a training loss, and I will regularize my optimization process through the complexity term to hopefully to generalize to other samples that are not in the training set. The two issues with this paradigm, one of them is the labels are scarce. Lake Mendota is very well observed for the last 30 years. You have thousands and thousands of observations, days of observations. But most of the lakes in the world or in the US have very few observations or no observations at all. So you can't train the models that are of high complexity. And as a result, the standard method for assessing generalization performance can break down. And the second thing is that what you're predicting could be physically consistent in many, many ways. For example, the lake water temperature relates to density, and the high density water should be sitting at the bottom. And if I'm predicting temperature that is not consistent with the density, depth density relationship, then I'm doing something wrong. Or if I am predicting temperature which does not conform to the law of energy conservation, then I'm doing something not quite right. So the question is, how do you incorporate that? And again, over the last 5-6 years, certainly in the last couple of years, a number of work have come up in which people would sort of add some sort of a physics-based regularization term to the objective function to make these systems learn to make them physically consistent. Okay. Now, one very important side benefit of being able to have the physics-based laws is that now you could learn even in absence of the observations. That is, if on certain days I don't have observations, I can still compute the physics-based laws. Of course, I do need observations to build the entire model, but if I have physics-based laws, I can even make use of the data on days on which I don't have the observations. And as a result, I can build a model like this. And you see this picture, the black portions are the black box data defined models, and the blue portions are the ones in which you're computing the energy flux terms, and you're creating a loss function. You're contributing a term to add to the loss function. And then in addition to this, you could also overcome the data sparsity challenge by pre-training with physics-based model, because physics-based model can create unlimited amount of output, not the observation, but the output that are driven by the drivers. And if you can train your your machine learning model using them, maybe your structure would come close enough to the reality, and then you need only a small number of observations to get to where you want to get to. So there are many, many different ways you can bring in physics into, or the knowledge into, the machine learning framework. Now, just to give you a sense of how this paradigm works in this very simple model system, very important, but relatively simple model system, you can see here, the green you see here is a graphic. On the vertical dimension is the test RMSE. Lower RMSE is better, so the higher points in this curve are better. And on the y dimension is the number of profiles, number of days of data that were used to train it. And you can see if I have a genetically calibrated GLM, that means it has been used with, it has not seen any observation data. It has a high RMSE of 3, but as you use more and more observations to calibrate it, its performance improves. But if I build a black box, simple state-of-the-art black box LSTM, it actually, given sufficient amount of data, it can actually outperform even the GLM. At the lower end, of course, it does very poorly. But the beauty here is that this LSTM doesn't know anything about the physics or the situation here. But of course, this thing makes a good story for Lake Mendota, for which we have a lot of data, but most of the lakes don't have much data at all. So, but if you put the process, the knowledge, and the machine learning together, which is the purple curve here, and then you can see that it sort of exceeds both of them. And even at very, very small number of observations, it can do dramatically better. So this sort of shows the power of using physics to get handle the sparsity. Okay. Now, I just want to highlight this point just for a minute, just to show you that such models can actually also do wonderfully well in out of sample scenarios. So what you're seeing here are two graphics, two graphs. Here on the left side, only both of these graphics have been trained with 500 observations, 500 data points, lots of data. But on the left picture, they are the training and test are similar in the sense that they are given data from the same seasons, spring, fall, and winter, and summer, and the testing also have the similar range of data, but they're from different years. Now, on the right side, the data, the training and tests are from different years, but the test from the training and test both, we hide from the training, we hide the data for the summer. And as a result, what you see is even the process-guided machine learning, process-guided models, green model, drops in performance. The machine learning model, the orange one, drops dramatically. Okay, and but the process-guided machine learning model drops, but very little. So what you're seeing here is a situation in which so the fact that the RNN, the orange model, dropped so much is not a surprise, because black box model cannot work with situations that they have never seen. So basically, if the training has never seen any data from summer, it's supposed to do pretty poorly. The green data is the physics model, but the green data has been calibrated using data only from spring, fall, and winter. It has never been shown the data from summer. So it drops dramatically because it doesn't have the proper calibration. But the data science model, by having learned both from the physics and the observations, which are actually from spring, fall, and winter, not from summer, it actually does dramatically better. So what happened in this case is that it learned the PGRNN learned the structure, overall structure from the GLM, the green model, and it learned the biases which sort of carried over on all seasons from the spring, fall, and winter, and it just did beautifully in the summer, relatively speaking. Okay? And this slide just simply shows that, yes, you can also use these PGRNN type models to also ensure energy consistency. So just since my time is up, I'm just going to conclude with my final remarks here to say that this paradigm of knowledge-guided machine learning offers, it's a promising direction for addressing limitations of pure machine learning models or pure process-guided approaches. And then you saw some preliminary results in the context of modeling temperature dynamics of a lake, but you're going to see in this workshop, in the remaining sessions spread across 3 days, this paradigm illustrated by number of speakers in many diverse domains. In fact, just the speaker who's coming right after next is going to be talking about quantum mechanics and fluid dynamics, in addition to aquatic systems, and how some of these methods can be used. And of course, what we're talking about here are just some very early and preliminary results. There's a long road for us to traverse collectively as a community. And one of the big questions, and it's a single bullet here, but it's a really big question, is how do you incorporate the complex physical knowledge, which can come in many shapes and forms, into the model learning and model architecture form, in the sense that, is it, and I suspect that as we work in this direction, as we work with different applications, we are going to see, not too far into the future, machine learning frameworks and paradigms that will revolutionize perhaps data science for everybody, just like the adoption of CNNs driven by the needs of the vision community, and RNNs and LSTMs driven by the needs of the speech and the language community have really revolutionized how we solve many, many problems. Then there are systems in physical sciences that have multiple components. I showed you a system of a single lake, but you can have network of streams that are interconnected. You can have a complex hydrological system, which may have, the surface hydrology, could have groundwater hydrology, could have evaporation from the crops on the ground, the trees and vegetation on the ground. Completely different physical systems. Each of them play their own role. And again, look at the global climate system. We're talking about far, far more complex situations there. And when you have these different components, How do you model each one of them using this KGML paradigm? How do you model them collectively while keeping the relationship among them scientifically correct, and then so forth. And so these are all the slide, the bullets 1 and 2 are actually very, very complex in many ways. And the last one, I'm just sort of talking about a bullet here as a direction which is sort of completely novel, or I should say completely foreign to the machine learning community, in the sense that we are used to building a model in which we are given the data and we make the prediction. And in many of the scientific scenarios, actually, there's a notion of data assimilation, which is as you make predictions and you observe the state of the system or some aspect of the system, and then you use that to make corrections in your state of the system that you're making use to make future predictions. And how do you bring this notion of data assimilation in this machine learning or the knowledge guided machine learning setting? So these are some of the questions that I believe that need to be addressed. And of course, as I said, we have a rich program. We have a great set of speakers, and they will be bringing their perspective. And like you, I am looking forward to listening from them and learning from them. So with that, I guess my time is up, and I'm going to...
Yes, Vipin, there are no questions for this first session.
Okay, so maybe we should just get started on the next talk.
Yes, with Anuj Karpatne from Virginia Tech.
All right, sure. So should I start screen sharing?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Can you all see my screen and hear me properly?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Hello everyone. I'm delighted to present today to such a wonderful audience. I'm an assistant professor in computer science at Virginia Tech, and in this talk, we'll be going through some of the research highlights in this area of science-guided machine learning, which is synonymous with KGML. And the last talk already set up the primer for this area. So this talk will do some deep dives into research promises in SGML, and we'll be illustrating these research promises in the context of several case studies. So by the end of this talk, you will have seen examples of how we can integrate diverse forms of scientific knowledge available as first principle physics or model simulations or ontologies. We'll have looked at different ways of integrating them in the machine learning framework. And we would have looked at different scientific applications, ranging from lake modeling to quantum mechanics to fluid dynamics to biology, illustrating the generality of this research area impacting several fields. Okay, so let's start with the first case study that was already discussed in the previous talk, which is in the application of lake modeling. Right. So in this problem, we are given some input drivers or X of the lake dynamics that we can feed to a physics-based model like GLM, which can simulate output variables such as temperature of the water. Right. And in this problem, the machine learning goal is to build a predictive model to go from X to Y using labeled examples of X and Y, and using knowledge of the physical relationships between X and Y, right? So what are some examples of these physical relationships? Well, we can look at the density depth physics, which is that density monotonically increases with depth. We can look at energy conservation and many other such principles, right? So given this knowledge, we can modify the learning of neural networks by looking at a modified science-guided learning objective, right? Which involves three basic terms. So the first term looks at the loss in our predictions, y hat, with respect to the ground truth y, that we want to minimize. The second term looks at the complexity of the model captured using regularization terms. And the third pillar that we are introducing to this learning objective is the consistency of our model predictions with respect to physical relationships. This is being captured using physics-guided loss functions. And we have a trade-off parameter, lambda physics, to balance the importance of physics-guided loss along with standard loss terms like prediction loss and model complexity. Okay, so if you look carefully, there is another advantage of using physics-guided loss, which is that it only depends on your predictions y hat and not on your ground truth y, right? For that reason, while we can only evaluate the prediction loss on labeled examples in DTR, right, we can in fact apply and evaluate physics-guided loss even on unlabeled examples, which we may have plentiful in number in many applications, right? So we are referring to the unlabeled set as DU. Right? So this is the general recipe for science-guided learning that we will keep on revisiting in different case studies. Okay, so the first thing that we want to understand is what's the advantage of using physics-guided loss functions and constructing physics-guided neural networks, or PGNs, right? So in our own work in lake modeling, we have demonstrated that by adding these physics loss terms, we can ensure better generalizability on novel testing scenarios, right? So you can train on certain seasons and test on other seasons and still ensure good generalization performance, right? And we can do that using far fewer samples in the labeled set DTR as compared to black box models, right? So these are some promising results on the use of physics-guided loss functions, and our work is definitely not the only and the final work in science-guided learning. In fact, there's a rapid growth in the number of papers published in the last 2 years on constructing physics-guided loss functions and integrating them in various applications. So one example of a promising line of work in this area is of physics-informed neural networks, or PINNs, where the goal is to use physics-guided loss functions to solve PDEs. So we would measure the consistency of neural networks with PDE-based equations, right? And this is one line of work that takes the idea of science-guided learning to the other extreme, where they perform their learning in a label-free fashion. So they would so this framework disregards any dependence on the labeled set DTR and solely relies on minimizing the prediction loss, along with satisfying the initial conditions and boundary conditions of PDEs, right? So given this rapid growth in the literature on using physics-guided loss functions, what we want to ask ourselves is do we have a final recipe of integrating scientific knowledge in any neural network learning procedure? Or are there some key research gaps that we need to address that pose open questions? Right? So here are some open questions that we are addressing in our own work. So the first question is, do we really need labeled examples, DTR, or should we perform label-free learning just using physics-guided loss functions in the spirit of PINNs, right? Remember that physics-guided loss functions can have their own trivial solutions and sometimes show poor local minima that can lead to non-generalizable results. B, from the labeled examples in DTR, so as to ensure generalizability of our model on novel testing scenarios, right? So for example, what if we evaluate our physics-guided loss only on DTR, only on the labeled examples? Can we still expect that we would generalize on novel testing scenarios? So that's a second question. Another fundamental question is, instead of using a constant lambda physics, can there be better ways to exploit the interplay between physics loss and data loss by adaptively modifying lambda physics during the course of neural network learning? And this is especially pertinent when we are dealing with multiple physics objectives, each having their own physics laws terms that can sometimes even conflict with each other. Right? So these are just a sample of open questions in science-guided learning, and we will address all of them in this very interesting case study in quantum mechanics. So we are looking at a very simple problem of an icing chain model using 4 particles, and we want to study the behavior of the system of 4 particles when there is an external magnetic field in the x direction, Bx, that is applied to the system. Right? So to study the system, what we really want to get to is the wave function psi. Right? And without getting into the specifics of the problem, let me remind you about the governing physics of this problem, which is the Schrödinger's equation, represented over here, which can be represented as an eigenvalue equation. So given the Hamiltonian matrix that is conditioned on Bx, we want to get to the wave function psi that satisfies this eigenvalue equation, right? And we actually want to get to the wave function that has the lowest energy, which is known as the ground state, right? So in this problem, we consider the machine learning goal of taking in H, the Hamiltonian matrix, as input and predicting the ground state wave function psi as the output, right? And in a similar style of science-guided learning, we want to do that using 3 loss terms. The first is the standard prediction loss, second is regularization, and the third has to account for the physics of the problem, right? Now, in this case, the way we have formulated our problem, there are actually 2 different physics laws that we want to consider. The first loss term is the Schrödinger loss, because we want our solution psi hat to comply with the Schrödinger equation, right? But along with complying with the S loss, we also want to find the lowest eigenvalue solution, right? So we also want to minimize our energy captured here using E loss. Okay? So here we are dealing with multiple physics objectives, and the simplest way to integrate them in the learning is to use constant trade-off parameters lambda S and lambda E, right? So this can work well if the 2 loss terms agree with each other, if they correlate with each other, right? But what we are dealing with in our problem is a scenario where we have competing physics objectives, where the S loss and the E loss can produce gradients that point to 2 very different directions. Right? And this is a problem that is general to many problems when you're dealing with multi-physics problems. For example, if you're looking at energy conservation and mass conservation together, right? What can happen here is that a simple addition of physics objectives may lead to local minima solutions, right? So for example, in this caricature diagram, if we just add these 2 physics objectives, right, it is easy to get stuck at local minima solutions, right? Whereas if we carefully execute the interplay between physics objective 1 and 2, there's a chance that we can get to global minima, right? So in this problem, a trivial addition using constant trade-off parameters is not sufficient, right? And the key question is, can we adaptively tune the importance of different loss terms to steer the learning to a generalizable solution, where the trade-off parameters change with the neural network stage of learning or the epoch, right? This is the crux of our proposed solution, which we are calling as coffee PGNN, PGNN with competing physics objectives. And the basic idea here is that we want to pay higher emphasis on the energy loss in the beginning epochs to avoid getting stuck in the local minimas of S loss. And later on, we want to turn on S loss once we are in the vicinity of a generalizable solution to refine our solution. Right? So I won't go into the details of the approach that has been developed by carefully analyzing the problem. But here are some results to demonstrate the value of adaptively tuning physics loss in a learning procedure. So we are looking at the cosine similarity as our evaluation metric, and we want to get close to 1. And we are looking at a scenario where the training data is sampled from a different phase for Bx less than 0.5, and the test data is from a completely different phase that we had no observations from in the labeled set. Right? So a neural network, a black box neural network, has a performance close to 0.96. If we apply coffee PGNN without using unlabeled examples, you would see that it does not improve. Actually, it degrades a little. And this is an example of the pitfalls in an improper use of physics guided loss functions, right? Because the physics guided loss functions have their own local minima. Instead of this, if we used unlabeled examples, but if we did not tune the trade-off parameters, what we would see is that sometimes we would get to the target solution, but there would be a large variance in our results because of the risk of ending up at one of the local minimas. Right? But if we look at our proposed solution, where we are adaptively tuning the weights, our results are much more consistent. And all of these models are much better than a label-free model. Right? If we just minimized the physics loss, we would have a cosine similarity of 0.63. Right? So this is a demonstration of why we want to balance physics loss with data loss. But to really understand what are the examples that are contributing to the better result of our coffee PGNN, we can actually look at the cosine similarity as a function of the BX. Right? So remember, we are only providing examples from this phase for training, whereas we are also testing on this particular phase. Right? So if you look at the cosine similarity, all of the models have similar performance in distribution samples, right? When Bx is less than 0.5, that we have in DTR. But it is when we go beyond DTR to the paramagnetic phase is when the real advantage of coffee PGNN kicks in. Right? So this is another demonstration of the generalizability to novel testing scenarios by using physics and data in an adaptive way. Okay, so this was one approach for using physics and data, but there are many other approaches for integrating scientific knowledge. For example, we can bake in the physics in the architecture of the neural networks. Okay? Now, this would have a central advantage from science-guided learning, which is that it would ensure physical consistency not only during model development, but also during model deployment once the model has been trained. Right? This is especially important when we care for robustness to minor perturbations in the model weights. For example, if we perform dropout during testing using Monte Carlo dropout. Right? So we wanted to think of a way to hard code the density depth physics in neural network models, and this is the basis of our approach on physics-guided architecture of LSTM models specific to lake modeling, where we would introduce physically meaningful intermediate variables in the neural network architecture, and also introduce novel connections in the LSTM between the LSTM nodes that ensure or guarantee that our predictions follow the density depth physics. Right? These modifications are shown as red. And what we can show with these modifications is that our results are always physically consistent, even during testing, even after applying Monte Carlo dropout. Right? So the red samples that you see show that our temperature monotonically behaves with depth, whereas the baseline methods, even after being trained using physics-guided loss functions, can easily be thrown off from being physically consistent when we perturb the model weights using Monte Carlo dropout. Okay, so this is just one example in lake modeling. But this idea of bringing in physics as intermediate variables is much more general. And here is another example in fluid dynamics, where the goal is to model the drag force experienced on particles in a moving fluid. Okay? So the typical approach to solve this is to look at expensive simulations, PRS simulations, to model the pressure and velocity around the particles that can then be used to predict drag forces. Right? But this is very expensive. So an alternate approach could be to use a simpler model, the DEM model, which works at a very coarse scale and considers each of these particles as point objects. Right? What we wanted to look at in this multi-scale problem is, can we create a hybrid model that goes from the predictions of a core scale model and predicts the drag force at the finest scales by being trained using PRS simulations. Right? And we want to do that not in a black box manner, but being cognizant that that there are physical intermediates such as the pressure and velocity fields that the neural network should produce. Right? So this was the basis of our another approach on building physics-guided neural network architectures that would go from input particles to drag force, but while constraining some of the hidden layers to express physically meaningful quantities. So this is just showing an illustration of how physics can change the architecture, and this can be applied to many other problems where we have knowledge of the mechanistic pathway from the inputs to the outputs. Okay, so finally, let me talk about another case study that goes beyond physics and gets into biology, and this is part of an NSF HDR project that we're working on, where the goal is to make use of different forms of biological knowledge, for example, phylogeny trees or ontologies, such that we can take in images of fish specimens and we can perform a variety of tasks. For example, we can perform species classification, or we can segment the different traits like eyes and fins and gills and everything. Right? So the question is, how do we inform our neural network for these image recognition problems using phylogenies and ontologies? Right? So let me talk about a simple problem of species classification. Right? So we're given an input image that we can run through a convolution network to predict the species class. Right? But we know that the species class have a structure represented through the phylogeny tree. Right? In particular, species that belong to the same genus share similar features. Right? So how do we bring that information in the convolution neural network? Right? One approach is to consider an alternate task to predict the genus, which is at a coarser scale, right? Using another block of convolutions, and use the intermediate features that we are learning for genus to augment the features for the species. Right? This is the biology guided neural network that we have explored, and our preliminary results show that this modification shows better classification accuracy than black box architectures, and we are in the process of understanding the saliency maps of our results to understand which parts of the input image contribute to the errors in the neural network models, right? So these are represented as saliency maps. But there is another very interesting observation that we found beyond better classification performance, which is that by bringing in biological knowledge, we are actually able to demonstrate better robustness to adversarial attacks. And this is central to many problems in computer vision, where there is a concern for security in machine learning. So here is a very simple adversarial attack setup, where we would occlude a certain portion or patch of the image that has the highest contribution to the saliency map, and then observe its impact on the neural network predictions, right? So here is an example image, and what we are looking at are the probabilities predicted by two different models, black box neural network and BGNN, right? And we know that the first class is the true class, right? So without any occlusions, we can see that both these models are doing a fair job, right? They are predicting the correct class, right? But what if we occlude a certain portion of the image that has the highest contribution to the saliency map, right? Now, with this occlusion, we are starving information to the neural network, and what we see is that both these models are impacted, right? But the impact of the BGNN is far smaller than the impact on the black box, which goes from 0.8 to 0.49, right? What if we do this again? What if we pick up another patch that has the highest contribution, which corresponds to the fin? And now what we will see is that the black box model will start predicting another class as the highest probability. It's actually getting confused, whereas we are still able to predict the right class, although with a lower probability. Right? So,
Anuj,
yeah.
We're getting close to time. We have one question. Can you wrap up?
Okay, sure. So, so these are some examples of different problems. Just to wrap up, we look at different SGML methods. We look at different objectives of SGML. Um, but this is a much richer space of exploration. You should read the survey article to look at different pockets of research that are happening, soliciting the need for institute level effort. Finally, we are conducting a symposium in AAAI, and we are working towards a book. So you're welcome to contribute to them. I'd like to acknowledge my funding sources, collaborators, and my wonderful students. Thank you.
Thank you, Anuj. So the question is, in aquatic ecology, we often do not refer to our data as unlabeled and labeled. Can you clarify what you mean by these terms?
Okay, very good. Let me go back to the very beginning, to the point where I first introduced labeled and unlabeled examples. Okay, so what we mean by labeled and unlabeled examples is that labeled examples are those data points where we have run a physics-based model to generate ground truth Y. Right? These can be expensive models that we would run. For example, in Schrodinger's equation, we would have exact solvers to get to Y, right? Which are giving us the ground truth. But in the lake modeling problem, we would have real world observations, right? So on all of those examples where we have close to perfect knowledge of the ground truth Y, all of those examples would contribute to the labeled set. Whereas all of those examples where we only have knowledge of X, the inputs, but no knowledge of Y, the output, would correspond to the unlabeled examples.
Okay. Thanks. There's another question as well. It says, very interesting presentation. How do we know the networks are not just learning to fit the simulation model?
Okay, very interesting question, right? So, so I think the answer depends on the application that we are looking at, right? So if we talk about applications in lake modeling, for example, where we have imperfect physics-based models, right? In those cases, we are not really training ourselves with the output of physics-based models, although we can do pre-training, and there will be a follow-up talk in this workshop that would talk about that. But in this case, we are directly going from X to the ground truth Y during training, and we are bringing in the physics, of course. Right? But in other problems, when we have exact solvers, for example, in quantum physics or in fluid dynamics, if we can run expensive solvers, we are trying to emulate that exact solver, and we want to do that in a computationally efficient way. So in those problems, once we have trained a model, we can apply it during testing with a very small cost of running. So I think it depends on the application we are looking at.
Okay, there is even one more question, if you can answer in just a couple minutes, or 1 minute maybe.
Sure. Yeah.
But it might be too long. How is the physics guided loss function defined?
How's the physics? Okay, very good. I couldn't get the time to define it here, but the physics guided loss is defined in terms of the violations of the physical principles, right? So for example, in lake dynamics, we would look at any violations of the density depth physics, right? Whenever density does not monotonically behave with depth, that would be a violation, and that would be the loss, right? Similarly, if the energy is not conserved, that would be a loss. Similarly, in Schrodinger equation, if the Schrodinger equation is not satisfied, that would be a loss, right? So we are also looking at the first principle physics here, and trying to see if that equation is satisfied or not.
Okay, thank you, Anuj. Let's move on to our next speaker, Markus Reichstein from Max Planck.
Hello. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
We can hear you.
Good. Okay. Yeah, let me give you another variation of this very important theme that was so brilliantly already introduced. So I would just, I'm actually not a machine learner by training, so I probably give you a little bit more of an applied view here, and in particular with respect to Earth system science. Maybe this is clear to everyone. I just want to reiterate the point, and it was made also clear before, that the Earth system in particular is a very challenging system because it is a very complex system combining biological, chemical, and physical processes together. And scientifically, it's also very challenging because it's a unique system, so we can't do multiple experiments like we can do with cells or plants and so on and so forth. So we basically often have to rely on the observations instead of being able to make explicit experiments. And it's also, of course, a spatial temporal system, and you can see here on the right-hand side, basically that it spans more than 17 orders of magnitude in terms of spatial scales that actually interact with each other in a hierarchical way. This Earth system view, also the view of different spheres like atmosphere, biosphere, oceans, and cryosphere, basically led to this kind of paradigm that is very important. This is physical modeling or mechanistic modeling or systems modeling, where the system is dissected into different subsystems, like here the physical climate system, or the biogeochemical system, then the marine systems, the terrestrial systems, and so on and so forth. This is a diagram from the 80s from Chris Bretherton, which was basically foundational to Earth system modeling. And basically the idea is if we can model the subsystems from kind of first principles and we wire everything together, then we will be able to describe the whole system behavior. But of course, it's difficult because it's a complex system, and I think the climate modeling community, or in particular the coupled carbon cycle climate modeling community, learned that lesson already 2006, and then reiterated in this paper by Pierre Friedingstein 2014, which basically shows how the different models actually predict how in the future land carbon will be taken up. I mean, I can't go into all the details of the carbon cycle, but basically the point is here that currently they kind of agree that there is mostly some uptake of carbon dioxide. It's roughly a quarter of our emissions. But if we move into the future, the models don't even, these complex models don't even agree on the sign. So some say there will be ample uptake in the future, and others say, oh, there will be even release from the biosphere to the atmosphere, which means that it will accelerate the greenhouse effect and warming. So these kind of feedbacks are obviously not modeled with high certainty, but rather there's quite some uncertainty. And this kind of crisis, I think, in the physical modeling of the climate system, led us actually to think also about what we can do about that, and basically trying to bring in the same paradigm, basically, that we need to combine machine learning or deep learning with process understanding in this kind of data-driven Earth system science, how I would call it in this context. It is also clear that Earth system data is one of the prototypical types of data for big data. I'm sure you're pretty aware of that. Maybe I would like to highlight actually that I think it is it's maybe indeed quite unique compared to other fields in terms of the variety, because we have so many different data sources. We have point observations at weather stations or these eddy covariance flux stations. We have airplane data that gives us insight over regions, or then the satellite observations, which covers the whole Earth every day or every week or every month. and provides us with indirect measurements of processes, but also with a huge amount of data that is acquired and needs to be interpreted. Give you one quick example from our own work that is kind of started almost 2 decades ago, which integrates a bit these different data sources and shows how one can do that. One type of observations are these local observations of ecosystems that tell, for example, how much carbon dioxide is taken up by the ecosystems, and that operates on a local scale of 1 kilometer and over several decades. So 1 kilometer is of course not the Earth, and even if we have 500 stations, this is certainly not covering the whole Earth. So we need to combine that with other information and with information that is available globally. And the example is of course the Earth observation, which observes the whole Earth globally, but maybe not, that doesn't directly measure the variable of interest. So for example, carbon uptake by the ecosystems is not directly measured by the satellites, but rather states of the vegetation, in particular the electromagnetic state of the vegetation. And so basic idea is here to make use of those two of the information at that intersection of the scales where both observational systems operate, and just use machine learning methods to extract the joint information and build a statistical model that then can be applied to the global scale. So it's nothing else actually than a regression model. It has been let's say this approach has been leading actually to a first totally data-driven view on what the ecosystems are doing, like in terms of photosynthesis on the upper left or evapotranspiration on the upper right. And what we could see here is quite plausible patterns derived from the data, from this merging of the data, like active systems in red during our summer in the northern hemisphere. We see also monsoonal systems here in Southeast Asia, and also quite some dynamics following the dry and wet seasons in the tropics. And then we see covariation of the water fluxes and sensible heat fluxes, but that would go too much. Of course, this is just basically, if you want, it's just a black box model, and one can do these animations with that and can be happy that one can derive plausible results. But of course, here's already the first plot that shows that we need to use, of course, those how we call upscale data to confront that with physically based models. This is one example here, and what we can see here, the gray is basically our data-driven model with the uncertainties, and what we can see here, particularly in the tropics, the process-based models of the carbon cycle had a much larger uncertainty than our data-driven estimate, and that can then lead to question hypotheses embedded in those models, particularly the ones with a high estimate, and that actually happened. And it can then, this confrontation with the models can then help to improve actually the models and help the science overall. The point that I would make, I would like to make actually with these pretty simple machine learning approaches that we use, we didn't really consider dynamic effects, or we only considered them with some hand designed features. So like what was the rain over the last 3 months or last 6 months. And in addition, also spatial context was not considered. So it was really a pixel by pixel prediction independent of the neighboring pixels. That probably already rings the bells. If we talk about temporal context and spatial context, then we are pretty quickly at deep learning paradigms, because this exactly exploits those structures. And here in this paper, we just want to make the point, and for many of you, it's probably also very obvious, that actually many of the classical machine learning tasks really map into earth science tasks, like object classification and localization relates to pattern classification, like hurricane detection or atmospheric river detection, drought detection, and so on and so forth. And the question of downscaling, getting to finer scales from climate forecasts or weather forecasts that are usually not at a kilometer or sub-kilometer scale. This statistical downscaling relates, of course, directly to super resolution and fusion in the computer vision arena. So these are quite static examples, and then we have kind of the I find more interesting even dynamic parts where we want to predict into the future and want to predict dynamic systems. Like video prediction is nothing else than forecasting fields of variables over the Earth, or language translation maps directly to dynamic time series modeling, where in both cases often your current behavior depends a lot on what happened on the context in the past. Like a word might have a different meaning depending on what has been said sentences before. And for the carbon cycle, often the trajectory of an ecosystem depends also on whether there have been, for example, clear cut 10 years ago or not. So very, very similar thing where legacy and history matters. Let me give you one example from our work regarding this part, which is again, of course, an Earth system question. I like it a lot. The question was, but can we predict whole landscape as seen from space? And the idea was basically, let's apply basically these pigs-to-pigs algorithm from Isola et al. To Earth system data, where you see, for example, climate data is pretty coarse. And the idea would be, can we predict basically a Sentinel-2 image, a true color image, but also NDVI image, for example, for a landscape. And what was interesting to see, yeah, it works actually quite well. You probably cannot distinguish here what were the targets and what were the predicted or the imagined image with a conditional generative adversarial network. So the upper one is predicted and the lower one is observed. So there's a huge potential of being able to predict these spatial patterns from the core scale information. Of course, this is a bit also cherry-picked. There are also worse examples. But if you look at and that's, I think, important to look at quantitative measures here, like how well, for example, the fractal dimension or cohesion or connectance of patches basically relate to or compare the target compares basically to the predicted ones. One can see that actually the GAN with convolutions and so on is always outperforming any methods that don't take into account the spatial context, like with spatial convolutions, which is not a big surprise, but it's good basically to see that there is actually structural information to be extracted, even if one has only core scale predictors. But of course, these methods are totally black box, and exactly the question of do we understand now what's going on, and do we achieve physical consistency is, of course, not achieved. So let me go into this more dynamic part, where I show you a first example how I think one can try to get understanding about the system, and this is about kind of memory effects, dynamic effects. So we would call memory effects that are just time-varying properties which depend on the past, possibly other latent variables. They are usually described in dynamical systems with differential equations or time-discrete analog equations. And maybe it's some examples. Vegetation development, for example, depends not on the current state only, but on the cumulative temperatures over winter, spring. That's modeled as temperature sum. Or if we look at soil moisture, a simple water balance will tell us the soil moisture at a certain state depends on the integral of the inflows and the outflow over a certain time. The last one is maybe too plant physiological. So this is kind of memory effect, and these kind of dynamic and memory effects, of course, can be well modeled with recurrent neural network approaches that are nicely shown here by from the web, basically, where exactly we have a state that is developing here. This is this age, and the state is influenced by input variables, and together with input variables, it will then produce also an output of the system, and that evolves. Since the state evolves over time, also the output evolves over time together with the input X here. And then, of course, it can be compared with a loss function against observations. I actually convinced myself, I don't know, 2016 or 17 on a short sabbatical, that this actually works quite well. I won't go into detail, but this is basically modeling NDVI time series over also greenness of vegetation, so it's a state variable also over Africa. And colleagues of mine did that with a random forest with very well-designed hand features of drought effects and so on. And I just plugged in all the climatological data and with a recurrent neural network, and got actually quite good agreement and some better agreement even than with the hand designed features. But again, with a black box approach. And now, if you want to understand the system better, for example, we want to understand better where are memory effects, where are historical effects more important than another. We were thinking that work of a PhD student. We thought, okay, what if we train the model first in a regular way, and then we do a shuffling of the time series, both the predictors and the targets. So basically, the temporal structure is destroyed, and then we say the memory effect is basically the error we make with a permutation. So the error when the model doesn't have access to all the temporal structure minus the error without permutation. Then one can do that, of course, also by shuffling only blocks of the time series, so that there can be access to some memory, like 2 time steps, 3 time steps, and so on and so forth. And that's actually quite interesting globally. The prediction of the NDVI, so where we see memory effects, is actually particularly in the semi-arid region. So that is indicating that these memory effects obviously relate a lot to soil moisture and water cycle. What we can see here also that this is basically the evolution over time. So how long does this memory effect go on? And it actually saturates pretty quickly. So after a couple of months already, which we were hoping that we would see some memory effects, carry over effects from the last year, but obviously at least it cannot be detected with such a broad approach like with an LSTM. But that's how I think one can extract knowledge about the Earth system by analyzing also the behavior of such more black box approaches. Next step would be to attribute that to specific drivers or latent states. Last thing, and that I think is really the most important, is that is really this link between physical modeling and machine learning. It was mentioned in the talks before. I think I come here actually a little bit more from the systems modeling perspective, so it's very complementary. Where we basically say have a submodel, and the output of one submodel is the input to another submodel, and the model overall is forced with some forcing. So and the models are usually parameterized with some what I call a meta model here. So this could be the weather model, and that could be how vegetation responds to this weather. And then of course I didn't show that here, but there is a feedback, can be a feedback as well. And we were wondering where in this kind of complex system model, which is a climate model at the end, can be climate model where machine learning can play a role, or data-driven approaches can play a role. Well, one thing that is, of course, can be always done for several reasons. Model evaluation, I won't go into model emulation, I don't go into detail. What's also interesting, if we don't trust really the output of one submodel as for the input of another submodel, we can actually derive a model, with machine learning output, like shown here. So it's kind of a modular approach where we can maybe test the submodel in a better way by making sure that it doesn't even get biased input. The whole thing of model evaluation, which is usually being done with a scatter plot or something like that, or maybe based on frequencies and so on and so forth, that can be, of course, much more refined with machine learning methods where one extracts a pattern, spatial temporal pattern, both in the observations and in the models. So that's nothing else than sophisticated residual analysis, if you want. And what is much more challenging, and what we alluded to before, is also what I would call a hybrid modeling, where a full submodel in the coupled model is basically replaced by a model that has learned from data, so a machine learning based model. And it's actually very similar because it's the, let's say, the limit and the boundary to a parameterization model is not always very very clear, but one could say, well, model parameterization, learning the model parameterization with a machine learning approach would be a similar approach that one can do. And it's a question if actually 1 and 2 are different or not. It's maybe more of a philosophical question. The point is that
Markus?
the idea, yeah.
Oh, we have one question.
Yes.
So if you can wrap up in a couple minutes, we'll have.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So then, yeah. So the idea is basically, let's go to the right-hand side immediately. That we basically have a physical model, like a physical diffusion model, that tells us how much water is evaporating from the leaves to the atmosphere. That is quite clear. But then we have a sequence of stomatal aperture, what the leaves are doing, and that's much less clear. And why not trying to model that with a machine learning approach like a recurrent neural network that gives the sequence of stomatal aperture, so that kind of the diffusion coefficient of the physical diffusion model, and then the diffusion model is applied to then predict the loss of water from the leaves and also the uptake from the leaves. Yeah, so again, I think it's really a complementary approach to what was presented before. I believe I will be, yeah, sorry that I'm a little bit out of time. I've just one quick example from respiration modeling, which is very similar. We have a physically based equation here on the bottom. And one of those parameters, the base respiration, can be modeled with a machine learning approach. And the idea is basically to try to infer this latent variable via combining this approach. We have been doing that. We get actually very plausible patterns. We even get diurnal variation of this parameter of this base respiration. So that's the idea, that we can maybe infer system states that are not accessible to observations directly. Yeah, sorry. We are doing that currently with a hydrological model, where we also try to infer states like soil moisture with a totally machine learning based approach on the top, and then integrating that into a hydrological model. So again, to achieve this consistency, it also works quite well. Sorry for that. Maybe I go quickly here. So we can basically then, with this data-driven, if you want data-driven assimilation system, get root zone soil moisture and anomalies of root zone soil moisture, quantities that have not been observed. And yeah, we are just looking into that, how it looks very plausible, or what we can really gain as knowledge. And I wrap up with the point that I don't want to make the point that climate modeling and so doesn't work, but rather that we should complement this hypothesis-driven approach with an observation-driven approach, and that at the end we have to combine these two approaches. And the interesting things actually come and drive science forward if models don't agree with observed patterns, and that's where we then have interesting puzzles and surprises, and we have to do this model data integration. Thanks for your attention.
Yep, thank you. The question is, I am wondering how the modeling of vegetation states you showed varies in different types of vegetation and ecosystems.
Yes, yeah, it does vary actually, and it is also a predictor. Couldn't go into detail, but it's written up, of course. So basically, the vegetation types as a static predictor. So the machine learning approach can actually learn that different vegetation types or different climate zones and areas actually do respond differently. I don't show this here explicitly. What we show here is basically different climate zones, so transition water-driven, transition energy-driven. The point is that at this relatively large scale, 0.5 degree pixels, one can also look into vegetation types, but often one has very, very mixed pixels. So that to look into that in more detail, it's probably very helpful to do to repeat these kind of things also on the higher resolution where the vegetation types are not mixed so much.
Okay, thank you. That concludes our first 3 talks. So we'll be back at 11:10. So we'll take a 15-minute break. So again, join us back at 11:10. Thank you.
Ray, are you there?
Yes, I am, Vipin.
So the Zoom link stays on for everybody, or Zoom link?
Yep. Yep. Everyone will be able to see the knowledge guided machine learning workshop slide that I've posted.
Okay, perfect. And they don't have to use the, and YouTube, of course, would stop now, or what? I guess YouTube will have a blank link too, I suppose.
It'll see and hear exactly what we're speaking right now.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. Okay, bye-bye.